a glimpse of dawn. The first light of dawn touches the marble columns of a Roman villa, casting long shadows across a garden where rosemary and sage release their morning perfume into the cool air. Here, in the year 59 before the Common Era, a young woman kneels among the herb beds, her fingers gentle against the silver-green leaves of lavender, not yet knowing that her name will echo through centuries as one of the most remarkable minds of her generation. Porcia Catonis moves through her garden with the quiet precision of someone who finds peace in ritual. The hem of her simple tunic brushes against the gravel paths as she checks each plant, each bloom, noting what has changed since yesterday's inspection. This is her sanctuary, this patch of earth where philosophy and practicality intertwine like the climbing vines that embrace the garden walls. You might think of Roman women as confined creatures, hidden away in domestic shadows, but Porcia inhabits a different world entirely. Her father, Marcus Porcius, Cato the Younger, has filled their home with scrolls and debates, with visitors who speak of virtue and wisdom as readily as others discuss the weather. She has grown up listening to conversations about stoicism, about living according to nature, about the courage required to face an uncertain world with grace. The morning air carries the sound of her father's voice from the atrium, already deep in discussion with a colleague about some matter of state. Portia pauses in her work, not to eavesdrop, but to appreciate the familiar rhythm of intellectual discourse that has been the soundtrack of her childhood. These conversations have shaped her as surely as the Mediterranean sun has warmed these stones. She rises from the herb bed, brushing soil from her hands, and walks to where a small fountain bubbles softly in the garden's center. The water catches the growing light, sending tiny rainbows dancing across the surface. Porcia cups the cool water in her palms, bringing it to her face, a morning ritual that grounds her in the present moment, in the simple reality of sensation and breath. This is what the Stoics teach, this attention to what is immediate and real, not the anxious projections about tomorrow, not the regrets that chain us to yesterday, but this, the weight of water in her hands, the scent of herbs in the air, the solid earth beneath her feet. Portia has been studying Stoic philosophy since she could read, but not in the way her tutors intended. While other girls her age focus on music and weaving, she finds herself drawn to the deeper questions. What does it mean to live virtuously? How do we maintain our integrity when the world around us seems to reward compromise? What is the relationship between wisdom and courage? These are not abstract puzzles to her. They feel urgent, necessary, like tools she will need for some future she cannot yet imagine. The garden gate creaks softly, and Portia looks up to see her father approaching. Marcus Cato moves with the measured gait of a man who has learned to carry heavy responsibilities lightly. His face, weathered by years of public service and private struggle, softens when he sees his daughter among her plants. "The herbs are thriving," he observes, settling onto a stone bench near the fountain. "You have your grandmother's touch with growing things." Portia joins him, grateful for these quiet moments before the day's demands claim his attention. "I was thinking about what you said yesterday, about the garden being a metaphor for the soul." Cato nods, pleased. "And what conclusions have you drawn?" "That both require patience," she says slowly, working through her thoughts aloud. "Both need tending, but not controlling. You can provide good soil, adequate water, protection from harsh winds, but you cannot force growth." Her father's smile is proud but not surprised. He has watched his daughter's mind develop like one of her carefully tended plants, reaching always toward light and understanding. The Stoics would say you are learning to work with nature rather than against it. "But what about when nature seems cruel?" Porcia asks. "When the storms come? When the plants die despite our care? What then?" It is not an idle question. Even at her young age, Portia has observed enough of life to know that good intentions and careful tending do not guarantee favorable outcomes. She has seen her father struggle with political defeats, watched friends face illness and loss, witnessed the gap between Stoic ideals and human reality. Cato considers her question seriously, as he always does. This is one of the gifts he has given his daughter, the knowledge that her thoughts matter, that her questions deserve thoughtful answers. Then we practice acceptance, he says finally. Not passive resignation, but active acceptance. We do what we can, with wisdom and courage, and we release our attachment to outcomes we cannot control. Porcia nods, but she can feel another question forming. And if we ourselves become the storm? If our actions cause harm despite our good intentions? This stops her father short. It is a sophisticated question, one that reveals how deeply she has been thinking about moral responsibility and human fallibility. For a moment, he sees not his young daughter, but the philosopher she is becoming. Someone who will grapple with these questions not just intellectually, but through lived experience. Then we practice what the Greeks call metanoia, he says, a changing of mind, a turning toward wisdom. We acknowledge our errors, make what amends we can, and use our mistakes as teachers. The sun has risen higher now, warming the garden stones and drawing more complex fragrances from the herbs. Somewhere in the villa, servants are beginning their daily tasks. The peaceful bubble of morning contemplation will soon give way to the demands of a Roman household. But for now, father and daughter sit in companionable silence, each lost in thought. Porcia finds herself wondering about the future, not with anxiety, but with a kind of philosophical curiosity. What challenges await her? What opportunities to practice these principles she is learning? What storms might she face, and what storms might she herself become? She cannot know, sitting here in the gentle morning light, that her life will unfold in ways both terrible and magnificent. Cannot imagine that she will one day be called upon to demonstrate courage that will astound even her Stoic teachers. Cannot foresee the choices that will test every principle she is now absorbing, like a plant absorbing sunlight. But perhaps this unknowing is itself a gift. Perhaps the morning garden, with its promise of growth and its acceptance of seasons, is preparing her in ways that no amount of anxious planning could accomplish. Porcia rises and returns to her herbs, her hands once again gentle among the leaves. Her father watches for a moment longer, then heads back toward the villa and the day's responsibilities. The garden settles into its peaceful rhythm. Bees visiting the flowering sage, water trickling softly in the fountain, shadows shifting slowly across the gravel paths. And in this ordinary morning, extraordinary foundations are being laid, seeds of wisdom planted, roots of character growing deep and strong in soil enriched by love and learning, and the ancient promise that virtue, once cultivated, can weather any storm. Echoes of Cato. As the seasons turn in that beloved garden, we watch a remarkable bond deepen between father and daughter. Cato the younger, a man whose very name carries the weight of Roman virtue, finds in Portia not just a child to protect, but a mind to nurture, a spirit that matches his own fierce dedication to principle. You see, Cato is no ordinary Roman father. While other men of his station focus solely on their sons' education, leaving daughters to learn only domestic arts, Cato recognizes something extraordinary in Porcia's keen intelligence. Her questions don't merely seek answers, they seek understanding. Her curiosity doesn't simply gather facts, it hungers for wisdom. In the cool mornings before the city fully awakens, they walk together through Rome's quieter streets. Cato points out the temples, the forums, the monuments, but not as a tour guide reciting history. Instead, he speaks of duty, of the difference between what is popular and what is right, of how a single person standing firm in virtue can change the course of nations. Remember, my dear one, he tells her as they pause before the temple of Jupiter, power without principle is mere tyranny. dressed in fine clothes. Porcia absorbs these lessons like morning dew settling into thirsty earth. She watches her father navigate the treacherous waters of Roman politics, never compromising, never bending his moral compass for convenience, even when it costs him, especially when it costs him. For these are turbulent times in Rome. The old republic, with its careful balance of power, is straining under the weight of ambitious men. Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, names that echo through the marble halls with increasing frequency, names spoken in whispers and shouts alike. Cato stands against the tide. While others make deals and forge convenient alliances, he remains steadfast. Porcia sees the toll this takes. The late nights when he returns home exhausted from Senate debates, the worry lines that deepen around his eyes. But she also sees something else. The quiet satisfaction of a man who can meet his own gaze in the mirror without flinching. Integrity, he explains to her one evening as they share a simple meal, is not about being perfect. It's about being consistent, about making choices based on principle rather than profit. These conversations shape more than Porcia's mind. They forge her character. She learns that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. That wisdom lies not in having all the answers, but in asking the right questions. As Portia reaches womanhood, the time comes for marriage. In Rome, this is rarely a matter of personal choice for young women of noble families. Marriages are alliances, political calculations wrapped in ceremony and celebration. Her father chooses Marcus Bibulus, a good man, Cato assures her, a man of principle who shares their family's values, someone who will respect her mind as well as her station. Porcia meets this news with the composure her father has taught her. She understands duty. She understands that her personal desires must sometimes yield to larger responsibilities. But understanding and accepting are not quite the same thing. Marcus Bibulus is indeed honorable, scholarly, kind in his distant way, but he is also much older, already established in his career and his habits. Their marriage, while respectful, lacks the spark of true partnership that Porcia had perhaps hoped for. Still, she finds ways to make this new life meaningful. Bibulus appreciates her intelligence, even if he doesn't quite know what to do with it. He allows her to manage their household with unusual independence, to receive visitors and engage in the intellectual discussions that feed her soul. Through these early years of marriage, Porcia maintains her close relationship with her father. She visits him regularly, seeking his counsel not just on domestic matters, but on the great questions of their time. How should one live when the world seems to be falling apart? How does one maintain virtue when surrounded by corruption? Cato's answers are always the same, yet somehow always fresh. Control what you can control, he reminds her. Accept what you cannot. And always, always choose virtue over convenience. These lessons prove essential as Rome's political climate grows increasingly unstable. The first triumvirate, that unofficial alliance between Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, dominates the political landscape. Traditional Roman values seem to bend and break under the pressure of their ambitions. Bibulus himself becomes a casualty of sorts. As consul, he finds himself repeatedly outmaneuvered by his co-consul, Julius Caesar. The humiliation is public and complete. Romans begin joking about the consulship of Julius and Caesar rather than Caesar and Bibulus. Porcia watches her husband's growing frustration with compassion and concern. She sees how political defeat can eat away at a man's confidence, how public humiliation can poison private happiness. But she also sees something else, the importance of having principles that exist independent of public approval. In quiet moments, she returns to her father's garden, the same paths where she first learned to think deeply about virtue and character. the same fountain where she discovered that wisdom often comes disguised as simple conversation. Now, as a married woman with her own household responsibilities, she understands these lessons differently. Philosophy isn't just about abstract principles. It's about how one chooses to live each day, how one responds to disappointment, how one finds meaning in duty, even when duty feels heavy. The bees still visit the flowering sage, the water still trickles softly, but Porcia herself has changed, grown deeper, more complex, ready for the greater challenges that await her. For this is only the beginning of her story. These early lessons in virtue and resilience, this foundation built in love and strengthened through trial, will soon be tested in ways she cannot yet imagine. Ink and intellect. The morning light filters through the columns of the peristyle, casting gentle shadows across the marble floor, where Porcia sits with her writing materials spread before her. Today, like so many others, she has chosen solitude over the social obligations that call to other women of her station. While her peers gather for gossip and games, she finds deeper satisfaction in the company of scrolls and the quiet scratch of stylus against wax. Her fingers move with practiced grace as she prepares her writing surface, smoothing the wax tablet until it gleams like honey in the sunlight. This ritual of preparation, the careful arrangement of materials, the moment of stillness before thought becomes word, brings her a peace that no amount of jewelry or fine fabric ever could. She's been reading Heraclitus this morning, wrestling with his paradoxes about the nature of change. No one steps in the same river twice, she murmurs to herself, testing the weight of the words. The concept fascinates her. This idea that everything flows, everything transforms, yet somehow maintains its essential nature. Like herself, perhaps, still recognizably Cato's daughter, yet shaped by each passing season into something new. The stylus pauses above the wax as she considers how to capture her thoughts. Writing, for Portia, is not mere record-keeping or correspondence. It is thinking made visible, a way of holding conversations with the great minds across centuries. When she writes about virtue, she imagines Socrates nodding approval. When she explores the nature of duty, she feels her father's presence beside her. Today's reflection centers on the relationship between knowledge and action. It is not enough, she writes carefully, to understand what is right. One must also cultivate the strength to do what is right, even when, especially when, it comes at personal cost. The words flow steadily, each letter formed with deliberate precision. A soft footstep announces the arrival of her personal slave, Lydia, carrying a tray of freshly ground pigments. This is another of Portia's pursuits, one that surprises visitors who expect to find her engaged only in austere, philosophical study. She creates her own inks, mixing colors with the same attention to detail she brings to her thoughts. The murex shells arrived from Tyre yesterday, Domina, Lydia reports quietly, setting down small ceramic bowls filled with powdered minerals and dried plants. And the master's secretary sent fresh oak galls from the villa. Porcia sets aside her stylus and moves to the preparation table, where she begins the ancient alchemy of ink making. The purple from the murex shells, precious as gold and twice as beautiful, will create the deep violet she uses for copying poetry. The oak galls, when mixed with iron and gum, produce the rich black perfect for philosophical texts. There is something deeply satisfying about this work. The grinding of minerals releases their hidden colors like secrets whispered to her alone. The careful measurement of proportions. Too much water and the ink runs thin. Too little, and it will not flow from the reed. Requires the same balance and precision that philosophy demands. As she works, grinding lapis lazuli into powder that captures the very essence of sky, Porcia reflects on the connection between this craft and her studies. Both require patience. Both transform raw materials into something useful, something beautiful. Both demand respect for tradition while leaving room for innovation. The morning progresses in this gentle rhythm: reading, writing, creating. When the sun reaches its zenith, she often pauses for what has become her favorite practice, copying passages from the great works. Today she chooses lines from Epictetus, his words about freedom resonating deeply as her reed moves across papyrus. Wealth consists in not having great possessions, she copies carefully, but in having few wants. Each letter forms with meditative precision, the ink flowing like liquid thought. This is how wisdom enters the soul, she believes, not through hurried reading, but through the slow, deliberate act of transcription that allows each word to settle into memory. The afternoon brings visitors, women from prominent families who come ostensibly for conversation, but really to observe this curious daughter of Cato who chooses books over banquets. Porcia receives them graciously in the tablinum, her writing materials discreetly set aside but never quite hidden. "You spend so much time with dusty scrolls," comments Claudia, wife of a rising senator. "Don't you find it lonely?" Portia considers the question seriously, as she does all inquiries into her choices. "I find it enriching," she replies finally. "These dusty scrolls contain the thoughts of minds that grappled with questions we still face. When I read Plato on justice or Aristotle on friendship, I am in conversation with teachers who have much to offer." The women exchange glances, the kind that speaks of indulgence for an eccentric but harmless hobby. They do not understand, and Portia does not expect them to. Her path has always been solitary in this way, not from any desire to be different, but from an inability to find satisfaction in pursuits that do not engage her fully. When evening comes and her guests depart, Portia returns to her true companions. By lamplight, she continues her copying, her ink-stained fingers moving steadily across the papyrus. The words of ancient sages flow through her hand onto the page, becoming part of her in ways that mere reading could never achieve. Tonight she works on a treatise about courage, how it differs from mere boldness, how it must be grounded in wisdom to be truly virtuous. The concepts feel important in ways she cannot yet fully articulate, as if she is preparing herself, building inner resources for challenges that remain hidden in the shadows of the future. The lamp burns low as Portia completes her evening's work. Tomorrow will bring more reading, more writing, more careful preparation of the tools that serve her mind. This daily practice of engaging with great thoughts and beautiful words, this cultivation of both intellect and craft, shapes her as surely as a sculptor shapes marble. In the growing darkness, she carefully cleans her reed pens and covers her ink pots, protecting the tools that help her think. The ritual of ending each day's work brings its own satisfaction, the sense of time well spent, of mind well fed, of spirit prepared for whatever tomorrow might require. The weight of loss. But even the most carefully tended gardens know seasons of loss, and Porcia's world, for all its philosophical preparation, cannot shield her from the weight of grief that comes with loving deeply. The news arrives on an ordinary morning, carried by a messenger whose dust-covered cloak speaks of urgent travel. Marcus Bibulus, her steady, thoughtful husband, has died suddenly while serving as governor of Syria. The words seem to hang in the air like smoke, refusing to settle into meaning. One moment she is a wife, planning the evening meal, wondering when he might return from his duties. The next, she is a widow, alone with the echo of his last letter still fresh in her memory. The house feels different immediately, as if the very walls understand that something fundamental has shifted. The servants move more quietly, their voices hushed with that particular reverence that accompanies sudden loss. Friends arrive with covered dishes and careful condolences, their presence both comforting and overwhelming. But in the midst of this flurry of sympathy and practical arrangements, Porcia finds herself retreating to the places where her father's teachings live most deeply. She walks to her garden, to the stone bench where she and Cato once discussed the nature of suffering. The olive trees offer their familiar shade, their silver-green leaves whispering in the breeze as they always have. Here, surrounded by the continuity of growing things, she begins the difficult work of understanding this new reality. The Stoics speak of acceptance, not the passive resignation that surrenders to fate, but the active choice to work with what cannot be changed. Grief, she realizes, is not something to be conquered or dismissed. It is something to be experienced fully, honestly, without the pretense that wisdom makes us immune to pain. Her father taught her that virtue lies not in avoiding suffering, but in how we choose to meet it. In the days that follow, Portia discovers the particular challenges that face a woman alone in Rome. Without a husband's protection, her position becomes more precarious, more dependent on the goodwill of male relatives and the careful navigation of social expectations. There are legal matters to resolve, property to manage, decisions about her future that others seem eager to make on her behalf. But the years of reading and thinking, of engaging with philosophy not as decoration, but as practical wisdom, serve her well now. She approaches each challenge methodically, consulting the right people, asking careful questions, refusing to be rushed into choices that will shape the rest of her life. The same discipline that helped her master the art of copying texts now helps her master the art of managing grief. Her writing becomes a refuge during these difficult months. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the house sleeps and the world holds its breath, she fills page after page with her thoughts. Some days she copies passages from Marcus Aurelius on the impermanence of all things. Other days she writes her own reflections on loss and memory and the strange way that absence can feel more present than presence ever did. The ink flows differently now, darker somehow, weighted with experience. Her hand moves across the papyrus with new authority, each letter formed by someone who has learned that knowledge tested by real suffering becomes wisdom. The philosophical principles she once understood intellectually now live in her bones, carved there by the daily practice of choosing hope over despair, engagement over withdrawal. Friends worry that she spends too much time alone. Too much time with her books and her thoughts. They suggest distractions, social gatherings, the kind of busy activity that might help her forget. But Porcia has learned something valuable in these months of solitude. She has discovered that she can be alone without being lonely, that her own mind, properly cultivated, is companion enough for the long conversations with truth that grief requires. The garden changes with the seasons, and she changes with it. Spring brings new growth, tender shoots pushing through soil that seemed barren just weeks before. She tends these emerging plants with particular care, understanding now in a visceral way the cycles of death and renewal that her father's philosophy always celebrated. Nothing is permanent, not joy, not sorrow, not even the sharp edge of fresh grief. As the months pass, she begins to notice how loss has changed her relationship with the present moment. Colors seem more vivid, the taste of honey more complex, the sound of rain against the roof more musical. It is as if grief has stripped away some protective layer, leaving her more sensitive to beauty, more aware of the preciousness of ordinary things. She thinks often of Marcus, not with the desperate clinging that prolongs suffering, but with gratitude for what was shared and acceptance of what has ended. Their marriage was built on mutual respect and genuine affection, qualities that death cannot diminish. She carries the best of what they created together: his steady kindness, his appreciation for her mind, his belief that a woman's thoughts matter as much as her domestic skills. The house gradually fills with new rhythms. Her rhythms. She rearranges the furniture to better catch the morning light for reading. She expands the herb garden, adding plants whose names she learned from studying medical texts. She begins receiving visitors who come not to offer sympathy, but to engage with her ideas, to benefit from the hard-won wisdom that suffering has refined into something genuinely useful. And slowly, so slowly she barely notices at first, she becomes aware that her story is not finished. The woman who emerges from this season of loss is different from the one who entered it. Stronger in some ways, more tender in others, but fundamentally herself. The philosophical foundation her father built has held firm under the weight of real testing. Now she knows not just what the Stoics taught about resilience, but what resilience actually feels like when it is all that stands between you and despair. The future remains unwritten, full of possibilities she cannot yet imagine, but she faces it with the quiet confidence of someone who has walked through darkness and found her own light sufficient for the journey. A marriage to Brutus. When Marcus Junius Brutus first comes calling, Porcia recognizes something familiar in his eyes. Not grief this time, but the same restless intelligence that drove her father to stand against corruption even when it cost him everything. Brutus carries himself with the weight of ancestral legacy, the burden of a name that stretches back to the founder of the Republic itself. Their courtship unfolds in libraries and gardens, over scrolls of philosophy and quiet conversations about duty. He speaks of his ancestor, the first Brutus, who drove out the last king and established the Republic 5 centuries before. She listens, understanding that he carries not just admiration for this legacy, but the crushing expectation to prove worthy of it. "Sometimes I wonder," he confesses one evening as they walk among the olive trees, "if a man can ever escape the shadow of his ancestors, or if he is doomed to spend his life trying to measure up to ghosts." Porcia stops walking and turns to face him fully. "My father taught me that we honor the past not by copying it, but by applying its wisdom to our own challenges. Your ancestor faced tyranny in his time. You face it in yours. The courage required is the same, even if the circumstances differ." Something shifts in his expression, a recognition that she sees not just the weight he carries, but the strength beneath it. This is not a woman who will simply admire his struggles from a distance. This is someone who understands what it means to inherit principles that demand everything of you. Their marriage ceremony is simple, by Roman standards, but rich with meaning that transcends ritual. As they clasp hands before the witnesses, Porcia feels the joining of 2 philosophical souls, 2 people committed to ideals larger than their own comfort or safety. The traditional words take on deeper resonance, a pledge not just to each other, but to the republic they both serve. In Brutus's house, Porcia discovers a different kind of domestic life than she knew with Bibulus. Where her first marriage was gentle and contemplative, this one pulses with political urgency. Senators arrive at all hours, their voices carrying through the atrium as they debate legislation, alliances, the growing power of Julius Caesar. She does not retreat to the women's quarters as convention suggests. Instead, she positions herself where she can hear, where she can understand the currents that shape their world. Brutus notices but does not object. He values her mind too much to waste it on trivial concerns. "What do you think of Cicero's proposal?" he asks her one evening after a particularly heated discussion with fellow senators. The question is not perfunctory. He genuinely wants her perspective. Porcia sets down her scroll and considers carefully. Cicero speaks beautifully of republican ideals, but he still believes they can be preserved through compromise with those who seek to destroy them. Sometimes preservation requires more decisive action. Brutus nods slowly. In her words, he hears echoes of his own growing conviction that the Republic cannot be saved through speeches and parliamentary procedure alone. The disease has spread too far, requires more radical treatment. As Caesar's power grows, their household becomes a gathering place for those who remember what Rome was meant to be. Porcia finds herself not just witnessing history, but helping to shape it. She copies sensitive correspondence, her careful handwriting carrying messages between conspirators. She observes the men who visit, noting who can be trusted, who wavers, who might betray them. The irony does not escape her. Her father spent his life in open opposition to corruption, standing in the forum and declaring his principles for all to hear. Now she finds herself part of something that must be planned in shadows, discussed in whispers, yet the goal remains the same: protecting the Republic from those who would destroy it. The weight of secrecy settles over their marriage like a heavy cloak. There are conversations that stop when slaves enter the room, letters that must be burned immediately after reading, friends who can no longer be trusted with casual remarks. Porcia watches her husband grow lean with the strain of it, sees how the burden of decision ages him. "You carry too much alone," she tells him one sleepless night as they lie listening to the distant sounds of the city. "Let me share more of this weight." "It is dangerous," he replies. "If we are discovered." "We are already discovered to each other," she says simply. "My fate is bound to yours now, not just in marriage, but in purpose. Use my mind, my hands, my courage. Do not protect me from the very cause we both serve." From that night forward, she becomes his true partner in the work ahead. She knows the names of the conspirators, understands the timeline they are building toward, helps refine the plans that will either save the Republic or destroy them all. The house fills with nervous energy as the Ides of March approach. Men arrive looking haunted, leave looking resolved. Porcia moves among them like a steady presence, offering wine, ensuring privacy, providing the domestic calm that allows desperate men to think clearly about desperate measures. She thinks often of her father during these days, wondering what he would make of this secret rebellion. Cato believed in working within the system, in the power of moral example and public virtue, but the system has failed. Moral example has been ignored. Public virtue has become a luxury the Republic can no longer afford. Sometimes the principles we inherit must be adapted to circumstances our teachers never imagined. Sometimes love of country requires actions that peaceful times would condemn. Porcia has learned to live with these contradictions, to find peace in the complexity of moral choice. The night before the Ides, she and Brutus sit together in their garden as the moon sets over the 7 hills. Neither speaks of what tomorrow will bring, but both feel the weight of it settling around them like morning mist. "Whatever happens," Brutus says finally, "I want you to know, you have made me braver than I ever thought possible. Not just because you support what we do, but because you understand why we must do it." Porcia takes his hand, feels the slight tremor in his fingers. Even the bravest men fear the unknown. "We act from love," she says quietly. "Love of what Rome was meant to be. Love of the ideals that made us who we are. Whatever the cost, that love makes us worthy of our ancestors." As dawn approaches, she feels the strange calm that comes before irrevocable action. Tomorrow will bring either triumph or catastrophe, either the restoration of the Republic or the end of everything they hold dear. But tonight, in this garden, with this man who shares her deepest convictions, she feels the profound satisfaction of a life lived in service to something greater than herself. The future rushes toward them like a river in flood, carrying possibilities too vast and terrible to fully comprehend. Storm clouds gathering. The morning after that tender moment in the garden, the city awakens to a different Rome. The Ides of March have come and gone, and with them, everything has changed. Caesar lies dead in the Senate House, his blood pooling on the marble floors where the Republic's fathers once debated in peace. The conspirators, Brutus among them, have struck their blow for freedom. But freedom, Porcia discovers, tastes nothing like she imagined. The streets buzz with confusion, with anger, with fear. Citizens huddle in doorways, whispering rumors that grow more terrible with each telling. Some speak of Caesar as a tyrant who deserved his fate. Others weep for him as a father to Rome. The city fractures along invisible lines, neighbor turning against neighbor, friend against friend. Porcia watches from her window as storm clouds gather over the 7 hills, both in the sky above and in the hearts of Rome's people. The wind carries the scent of rain and something else, something that tastes of ash and endings. Brutus comes home each evening more haggard than the last, his face etched with lines that weren't there before. The weight of what he's done, what they've all done, settles on his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. He speaks little of the Senate meetings, of the growing opposition, of Mark Antony's fiery speeches that turn the crowds against them. But Porcia sees it all in his eyes, the doubt creeping in, like winter frost, the growing realization that killing Caesar may have been easier than living with the consequences. "We thought we were physicians," he tells her one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. "We thought we could cut out the disease and leave the body whole, but perhaps we've only hastened the patient's death." She takes his hands in hers, feeling how they tremble with exhaustion. These hands that once wrote poetry, that traced philosophical arguments in the sand, that touched her face with such tenderness, now they carry the memory of steel, of blood, of a moment that can never be undone. "You acted from virtue," she reminds him, though her own voice wavers, "from love of Rome, from duty to the Republic." But even as she speaks these words, she feels their fragility. Virtue and duty seem such small things against the vast machinery of consequence now grinding into motion around them. The nights grow longer, filled with sounds that make them both start awake. Footsteps in the street, voices raised in anger, the distant clash of weapons as rival gangs settle scores in the darkness. Rome bleeds, and they have opened the wound. Porcia finds herself returning again and again to her father's teachings, seeking comfort in the ancient wisdom that once seemed so clear and certain. "What is, Cato would say. Accept what cannot be changed. Act on what can be, and have the wisdom to know the difference." But how do you accept a world spinning toward chaos? How do you act when every choice seems to lead deeper into shadow? She walks through her garden in the early morning hours, when the city still sleeps and the air tastes clean. The herbs she planted with such hope still grow, still offer their quiet medicine to anyone wise enough to receive it. The olive tree her father gave her spreads its silver-green branches toward the lightening sky, unchanged by human folly, constant as the turning seasons. Here, among these growing things, she can almost convince herself that peace is still possible, that Rome might yet remember what it was meant to be, a place where law matters more than power, where virtue guides action, where the common good outweighs personal ambition. But then the sun rises fully, and the city wakes, and the sounds of a wounded civilization reach even her sanctuary. Letters arrive from friends in distant provinces, speaking of armies gathering, of ambitious men who see opportunity in Rome's confusion. The Republic her husband died to preserve fractures a little more each day, like a precious vase dropped on stone, the cracks spreading outward in patterns too complex to predict or control. And through it all, Portia waits. She tends her garden. She reads her philosophy. She offers what comfort she can to the man she loves, but beneath the surface of these daily rituals, anxiety gnaws at her like a persistent hunger. The storm clouds that began gathering on the Ides of March grow darker each day, pregnant with lightning, heavy with the promise of floods to come. A legacy of strength. But even as the political world fractures around her, even as the future grows more uncertain with each passing day, there is something unchanging in Portia herself, something that has been forged in the crucible of loss, tempered by the discipline of philosophy, and strengthened by the quiet courage of a woman who has learned to trust her own mind. In the evenings, when the reports from the field grow too heavy to bear, she retreats to her library. The scrolls line the walls like silent witnesses. Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, Chrysippus and Cleanthes, their words offering the same steady wisdom they have provided for generations. She runs her fingers along the papyrus, feeling the slight roughness of the surface, the way the ink has settled into the fibers over time. Here, surrounded by these ancient voices, she finds a peace that the outside world cannot touch. The lamp flame flickers gently, casting dancing shadows across the carefully copied texts. Some of these scrolls she has written herself, her own hand preserving the thoughts of philosophers who understood that true strength comes not from controlling events, but from controlling one's response to them. What disturbs people's minds, she reads aloud softly, is not events, but their judgment on events. Epictetus understood, as she now understands, that the external world will always be beyond our complete control. Empires rise and fall, leaders live and die, but the inner citadel of the soul, that remains inviolate. She thinks of her father, how he chose death rather than compromise his principles. At the time, it seemed like defeat, like a terrible waste of a noble life. But now, in the gathering darkness of these uncertain times, she begins to see it differently. Cato's death was not a defeat, but a declaration, a statement that some things matter more than survival, that integrity itself can be a form of victory. The oil in the lamp burns steadily, a small circle of light in the vast darkness of night. Such a simple thing, this flame. Yet it transforms everything around it. The shadows retreat. The words on the scrolls become visible. The familiar comfort of her sanctuary emerges from the void. One small light, but enough to read by, enough to think by, enough to live by. History will remember Portia, though not always kindly, not always accurately. The stories will say she died by swallowing burning coals, a death as dramatic and uncompromising as her father's. Whether this is true, whether she chose such an end when news came of Brutus's defeat at Philippi, we cannot know with certainty. The historical record, like all records of women's lives, is fragmented, incomplete, filtered through the perspectives of men who often misunderstood the very women they claimed to describe. But perhaps the manner of her death, whatever it was, matters less than the manner of her life. For Porcia, Catonis lived as a philosopher, not merely someone who studied philosophy, but someone who embodied it. She faced loss without bitterness, uncertainty without panic, love without losing herself. She stood as an equal partner to one of Rome's most complex men. She participated in decisions that shaped the course of history. She maintained her intellectual independence even when it would have been easier to simply follow. In her library tonight, in this moment suspended between past and future, she represents something timeless, the woman who refuses to be diminished by circumstances, who finds in books and ideas a strength that no external force can touch, who understands that true power lies not in controlling others, but in governing oneself. The scrolls around her contain the wisdom of ages, but they also contain something else: hope. The hope that human beings can rise above their immediate circumstances, can choose virtue over expedience, can find meaning even in the midst of chaos. This is what the Stoics taught, and this is what Portia has learned to live. She sets down the scroll she has been reading, and for a moment simply sits in the gentle circle of lamplight. Outside, Rome continues its convulsions. Armies march toward their destinies. The Republic breathes its last labored breaths. But here, in this quiet space, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, there is only peace. The flame burns on, steady and sure, casting its warm glow across the words that have survived empires, across the face of a woman who has learned what it means to be truly free. Not free from consequences, not free from loss or pain or the weight of difficult choices, but free in the deepest sense, free to choose her response, free to maintain her integrity, free to find meaning in whatever circumstances arise. This is her legacy. Not just the dramatic gesture that history may or may not accurately record, but this quiet strength, this philosophical courage, this demonstration that a woman's mind, properly cultivated, can be as powerful as any army, as enduring as any monument, as bright as any flame that refuses to be extinguished. The oil lamp flickers once, twice, then settles back into its steady burning, illuminating the peaceful face of a woman who is found, in the midst of a crumbling world, something that cannot crumble, something that will endure long after the last scroll has crumbled to dust, the eternal light of wisdom, burning on. Final image, and so the flame burns on, steady and sure, casting its golden circle of light against the gathering darkness of the Roman night, while somewhere in that gentle glow, the essence of Porcia Catonis lives and breathes, not in the marble statues that will never be carved for her, not in the histories that will barely mention her name, but in something far more enduring, the quiet revolution of a mind that refused to be diminished, a spirit that chose wisdom over comfort, courage over safety, truth over convenience. The oil lamp sits upon her writing desk, surrounded by the tools of her craft, the reed pens worn smooth by countless hours of copying, the small clay vessels that once held her carefully mixed inks, the pumice stones for smoothing papyrus, the bronze stylus for her wax tablets, each object holding within it the memory of her touch, the echo of her thoughts, the residue of her dreams. And in this sacred space where philosophy met practice, where ancient wisdom found new expression through her careful hand, the light continues to burn, patient and eternal, asking nothing, giving everything. The scrolls around the lamp seem to breathe in the flickering light, their surfaces alive with shadows that dance across words, written in languages both familiar and foreign. Greek philosophers whose thoughts she made her own, Roman historians whose chronicles she studied and questioned, poets whose verses she copied not just for their beauty, but for their truth, and scattered among these ancient voices, her own writings, her own thoughts, her own quiet contributions to the great conversation that spans centuries, fragments of a brilliant mind that dared to think, to question, to challenge, to grow. In the gentle wavering of the flame, we can almost see her there, bent over her work in the quiet hours before dawn, her dark hair falling forward as she concentrates, her careful fingers guiding the pen across the papyrus, forming letters that carry the weight of centuries, copying the words of Zeno and Chrysippus, adding her own marginal notes, her own insights, her own questions, building bridges between the wisdom of the past and the needs of the present, one careful stroke at a time, one thoughtful word at a time, one moment of quiet rebellion at a time. The lamp burns for all the conversations she shared with her father in their garden, where philosophy was not an abstract exercise, but a living practice, where questions mattered more than answers, where thinking was not just permitted, but encouraged, celebrated, cherished. The flame holds the memory of those precious hours when a young girl learned that her mind was not something to be hidden or diminished, but something to be cultivated, nourished, allowed to flourish like the herbs and flowers in their peaceful sanctuary. It burns for her first marriage, for the quiet years when she learned to navigate the complex currents of Roman society while staying true to her philosophical foundations, for the moments when she chose solitude over empty socializing, reading over gossip, thinking over performing. The light remembers her widowhood, those months of grief that became months of discovery, when she learned that she could carry sorrow without being broken by it, that she could face uncertainty without losing her center, that she could be alone without being lonely, because she had cultivated an inner companion that would never abandon her, the steady presence of her own examined thoughts. The flame dances with the memory of her great love, her marriage to Brutus, not just the passion of two hearts finding each other, but the deeper joy of two minds meeting as equals, two souls committed to the same ideals, the same vision of what Rome could be, what humanity could become. The light holds their whispered conversations in the darkness, their shared fears and hopes, their mutual commitment to something larger than themselves, something worth the ultimate sacrifice, worth the ultimate price. And in its steady burning, the lamp remembers the aftermath, the chaos and uncertainty that followed their desperate gamble for freedom, the way she held fast to her principles even as the world crumbled around her, the way she chose to face the future with clear eyes and an unbroken spirit, understanding that some victories are measured not in immediate success, but in the integrity of the attempt, the purity of the intention, the courage to act according to one's deepest convictions, regardless of the cost. The oil feeds the flame drop by precious drop, just as wisdom feeds the soul, slowly, steadily, sustainably, never rushing, never forcing, simply providing what is needed, when it is needed, for as long as it is needed. And in this patient process, this gentle alchemy of fuel and fire, we find the perfect metaphor for a life well lived, a mind well cultivated, a spirit well tended, burning bright not through sudden bursts of dramatic intensity, but through the accumulated power of countless small choices, countless quiet moments, countless decisions to choose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, wisdom over mere cleverness. The shadows on the walls seem to whisper her story, telling it again and again to anyone who has eyes to see, ears to hear, hearts to understand. The story of a woman who lived 2,000 years ago, but whose example burns as bright today as ever, whose choices speak across the centuries to every soul who has ever felt the call to think, to question, to grow, to become more than the world expects, more than circumstances demand, more than fear allows. And as the night deepens around that small circle of golden light, as Rome sleeps and dreams and prepares for whatever tomorrow will bring, the lamp continues its patient vigil, burning for every woman who has ever chosen wisdom over ignorance, courage over fear, authenticity over performance, burning for every soul who has discovered that the greatest revolution begins not in the streets or the Senate, but in the quiet sanctuary of one's own mind, where thoughts are born, where convictions are forged, where the eternal flame of human dignity and wisdom burns on, and on, and on, steady as a heartbeat, bright as hope, enduring as love itself, illuminating the darkness, warming the night, reminding us all that some lights, once lit, can never, ever be extinguished.